Bruce Lee was demonstrating when Dan Inosanto, his top student, thought he could react quicker and then. The invisible challenge. Bruce Lee's dojo was plunged into a tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the students breathing around them. In the center of the mat, Bruce demonstrated a Jeet Kune Do sequence, fluid, precise movements, as if each strike was an extension of his own thought. His eyes, sharp as blades, observed every detail, every micro-expression of those present. Dan Inosanto, his most advanced student, watched with an erect posture, his fingers slightly clenched. He had trained for years under Bruce's tutelage, absorbing not just techniques but the philosophy behind them. And at that moment, a voice whispered in his mind, "I can react faster." Bruce stopped abruptly, as if he had read her thoughts. An almost imperceptible smile curved his lips. "Dan," he said, his voice calm, but filled with an unspoken challenge. "Do you think you can intercept before I even move?" Dan hesitated. It wasn't a rhetorical question. Bruce was offering him a lesson, or a test. "Yes, Sifu," he replied, straightening his shoulders. Bruce nodded, taking a step back. His muscles relaxed, but Dan knew that apparent tranquility was a trap. The master didn't need tension to attack. "Then prove it." The air seemed to freeze. Dan took a deep breath, his senses heightened. Bruce didn't move. It didn't blink. But Dan felt it, a tiny shift of weight, an almost palpable intent in the air. He reacted instantly, throwing a punch straight at Bruce's chest. The coup never arrived. In a movement that defied perception, Bruce dodged, turning his body out of the path of the punch, and counterattacked with a finger jab that stopped millimeters from Dan's neck. The student froze, his eyes wide. "You reacted to what you thought I would do," said Bruce, lowering his hand. "No to what I did." Dan swallowed hard. He had fallen into the same trap as always, the illusion of anticipation. Bruce hadn't moved first, he had thought first. And that made all the difference. "Jeet Kune Do isn't about speed," Bruce continued, walking in circles around Dan. "It's about economy of movement. About seeing what others don't see. You tried to beat me at my own game, but you forgot that the game isn't about who's faster, it's about who understands faster." Dan hung his head, embarrassed. But Bruce placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not a defeat. It's a lesson. Now, train until your body understands what your mind can't yet see." The royal confrontation. Weeks later, Dan was in a dark Hong Kong alley, cornered by 3 men armed with knives. He had followed an informant who promised information about a criminal organization linked to the trafficking of stolen art, and had been ambushed. The men advanced, smiling. One of them, the leader, brandished the knife arrogantly. "The great Dan Inosanto, student of Bruce Lee. Let's see if your master taught you how to fight with blades." Dan took a deep breath. There was no time to think. Just act. The first attacker advanced with a diagonal strike. Dan dodged it with a packsaw, redirecting the man's arm, and counterattacked with a low kick that knocked him down. The second came with a frontal thrust. Dan spun around, using the attacker's own momentum to unbalance him, and finished with an elbow to the temple. The leader, however, was different. He didn't attack right away. He stood still, watching, as Bruce had done in the dojo. "Interesting," he murmured. "You've learned to react. But you haven't yet learned to see." Dan felt a chill. The man attacked, not with the knife, but with a spinning kick. Dan blocked, but the next blow came from another angle, too quickly. The blade tore through his arm, a shallow but painful cut. "Bruce Lee taught you to fight, but not to think like him," said the leader, circling him. "You still react. He anticipates." Dan gritted his teeth. Blood was running down his arm, but he couldn't afford to feel pain. "I needed to see, not the movements, but the intentions." The leader attacked again, this time with a feint. Dan didn't fall into the trap. Instead of blocking, he moved to the side, letting the blow pass, and grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the knife dropped. A kick to the knee knocked him down. The leader rolled to the ground but quickly got up, pulling a second knife from his boot. Impressive. But it's still not enough. Dan didn't respond. He knew what was coming. Not because it was faster, but because, for the first time, I understood. When the leader attacked, Dan didn't block. He dodged, using the attacker's own movement to disarm him with a wrist trap, and finished with a precise punch to the solar plexus. The man fell to his knees, panting. "Now you're beginning to understand," said Dan, breathing hard. The leader spat out blood, but smiled. Maybe. But Bruce Lee wouldn't be proud of a student who had to be beaten to learn. Dan didn't respond. He knew that the real lesson was not in the victory, but in what he had realized in that alley. It wasn't about being faster. It was about being more aware. The last lesson. Months later, Bruce Lee was in the hospital, weakened by the mysterious allergic reaction that would take him too soon. Dan sat next to her bed, holding her hand. "Sifu." "I understand," said Dan, his voice breaking. "I finally understand." Bruce smiled, weak but genuine. "I know. You fought the leader of that gang. And you won not because you were faster, but because you saw." Dan nodded. "They said I didn't think like you. But now, I do." Bruce closed his eyes for a moment, as if savoring those words. "Jeet Kune Do isn't mine, Dan. It never was. It's a path. And you found yours." Dan squeezed his hand, trying to hold back the tears. "I will continue. I will teach. As you taught me." Bruce opened his eyes again, now with an intensity that Dan hadn't seen in a long time. "No. Not like I taught. Better than I taught." And then, with one last breath, Bruce Lee closed his eyes forever. Dan stood there, motionless, for a long time. When he finally stood up, he knew he wasn't just carrying on the legacy of a master. "I was carrying a responsibility." And for the first time, he felt he was ready. Dan remained next to Bruce's body for hours, his fingers still intertwined with his, as if the simple touch could postpone the inevitable. The room was silent except for the distant sound of Hong Kong traffic and the occasional hum of a ceiling fan, whose blades turned lazily, spreading warm air. The smell of burning incense mixed with the sweat and wax on the wooden floor, an aroma that, from then on, would always remind him of that moment. When he finally let go of Bruce's hand, it was as if a part of him had also fallen away. He got up slowly, his knees shaking, and walked to the window. Outside, the city pulsed, indifferently. Children ran through the narrow streets, street vendors shouted their offers, and the port, in the distance, showed ships arriving and departing, carrying stories that would never be told. Dan pressed his forehead against the cold glass, closing his eyes tightly. He didn't cry. Not yet. The funeral. 3 days later, the Buddhist temple hall was packed. Students, friends, family, and even strangers who had been touched in some way by Bruce Lee's presence gathered to pay their last respects. Dan, dressed in an immaculate white gi, stood next to the coffin, accepting condolences with a serene expression, but his knuckles were white from gripping his own hands and betrayed his tension. Among those present were names he recognized only from magazines or behind the scenes at movies: James Coburn, who hugged Dan as if he were an old friend, Steve McQueen, with red eyes and a bottle of whiskey half hidden in his jacket pocket, and even Linda Lee, Bruce's widow, who shook his hand with a sad smile and said, "He talked about you a lot. He said you were the only one who really understood." But it was among the lesser-known students that Dan found the most significant looks. Young people of all ages, some with fresh bruises on their arms, others with scars from old training, watched him as if waiting for an answer. An answer he didn't yet have. When the monk began chanting, Dan closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. The Cantonese words were incomprehensible, but the melody was ancient, filled with a sadness that transcended languages. At some point, he felt a small, rough hand hold his own. It was Brandon, Bruce's son, then only 8 years old, looking at him with the same intense eyes as his father. "You're going to keep teaching, aren't you?" asked the boy, his voice shaking. Dan swallowed hard. It wasn't fair that a child had to ask that question. But life was rarely fair. "I will," he replied, shaking Brandon's little hand. "I promise." The first step. The dojo was empty when Dan arrived that night. The lights were off, and the only illumination came from the street lamps, which cast long shadows on the mirrors and punching bags. He turned on a single lamp in the corner, enough to see his own reflection in the glass. He took off his gi and put on an old t-shirt and sweatpants. For a moment, he stood in the center of the room, breathing deeply. Then he closed his eyes and began to move. They weren't the precise, calculated movements Bruce had taught him. They weren't the choreographed sequences in the movies. They were instinctive movements, born from the need to fill the void that Bruce's absence had left. Dan kicked the air, spun, dodged imaginary enemies, as if each blow could take away the pain. Sweat ran down his forehead, but he didn't stop. Not until his muscles burned and his breathing became labored. When he finally fell to his knees, exhausted, he realized that something had changed. It was no longer the student trying to imitate the master. It was himself. And for once, it didn't scare him. The legacy. The following months were of reconstruction. Dan transformed the dojo into a space not just for training, but for learning. He summoned Bruce's oldest students and, together, they began to document everything: techniques, philosophies, anecdotes that Bruce told during training. He recorded audio tapes, wrote entire notebooks by hand, and even convinced Linda to share some of the letters Bruce had left. But the real challenge came when the first new students started to appear. Young people full of questions, some arrogant, others insecure, all in search of something that not even they knew how to define. Dan watched them with a mix of patience and frustration. How do you teach someone what Bruce had taught you? How to convey not just movements, but a way of seeing the world? It was then that he decided to change the rules. There would be no more rigid hierarchies. There would be no traditional belts or degrees. Each student would be encouraged to find their own path, just as Bruce had done with him. Some gave up. Others, like a young girl named May, who had arrived at the dojo afraid of everything, flourished. She started out shy, but over time, her movements gained confidence, and Dan saw the same sparkle in her that he had once seen in himself. The letter. A year after Bruce's death, Dan received a manila envelope in the mail. There was no sender, just his name handwritten in a handwriting he recognized immediately. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, with the following words. *, Dan. If you're reading this, it means I left earlier than expected. Don't be sad. Death is not the end, but a transformation, like water turning to steam. Remember, Jeet Kune Do is not a style, but an attitude. Don't teach people to fight like me. Teach them to fight like themselves. The world doesn't need more copies. Need originals. And most of all, don't be afraid to fail. I failed many times. But it was in mistakes that I found the best lessons. Continue. Always. Bruce *. Dan folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. I didn't need her anymore. The words were already engraved in his mind. The new path. Years passed. The dojo grew, changed addresses, gained new students and lost others. Dan grew older, but his movements remained agile, as if time dared not slow him down. He never married, never had children, but he found a family in those who trained alongside him. One night, as he closed the dojo, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and came face to face with Brandon, now a tall and strong young man, with the same eyes as his father. I want to train with you, said the boy, bluntly. Dan smiled. It wasn't the first time a student's child had appeared there, but this one was different. Why? He asked, crossing his arms. Brandon hesitated for a second, then replied, because I want to understand who he was. Not just as an actor or a fighter, but as a person. Dan nodded. I knew that conversation was inevitable. Okay. But I'm not going to treat you any different. You're going to sweat, you're going to fall, and you're going to wonder why the hell you're here. Brandon smiled, a smile that was a pure copy of Bruce's. I expected nothing less. As the two entered the dojo, Dan felt the weight of responsibility once again. But now, it wasn't a burden. It was an honor. And for the first time since Bruce left, he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Dan closed the dojo door behind him, leaving the noise of the street behind. The space was immersed in silence, only interrupted by the creaking of the floorboards beneath his feet. Brandon stood in the center of the mat, looking around as if every detail could reveal something about his father. The walls, covered in black and white photographs of historic fights, also displayed images of Bruce in moments of training, sweat running down his face, muscles tense, the glow of a determination that Dan recognized as unique. This was his place, said Dan, breaking the silence. Not just to train. To think. To breathe. Brandon touched one of the boxing gloves hanging from a hook, worn from use. Dan watched the gesture, remembering how Bruce used to adjust them before every workout, as if they were an extension of his hands. Was he talking about me? Brandon asked, without looking at Dan. More than you know. Dan walked to an old cabinet in the corner, opened a drawer, and took out a worn leather notebook. He wrote things down. Trainings, strategies, but also thoughts. Sometimes even dreams. He handed the notebook to Brandon. Here. It's yours now. Brandon hesitated before picking it up, as if he was afraid it might burn his hands. When he finally opened it, he recognized his father's handwriting, slanted, firm, almost aggressive letters. The first page was dated years ago. Today Brandon took his first steps. I'm not there to see it, but Dan told me. I hope he's stronger than me. That he doesn't have to fight as much as I did. The words seemed to pierce through Brandon. He closed the notebook carefully, as if he could preserve this moment forever. You're going to train with me every day, Dan said, returning to the center of the mat. But it's not just about technique. It's about understanding what he understood, that the fight is not just against an opponent. It's against your own limits. Brandon nodded, setting the notebook aside. He took off his shirt, revealing a thin body, but with the same lean, agile structure that Dan recognized in Bruce. The two positioned themselves, facing each other, and Dan wasted no time. First, you will learn to fall. Because if you don't know how to fall, you will never know how to get up. And so it began. The first few days were brutal. Brandon fell countless times, his knees and elbows marked with purple bruises. Dan didn't soften the blows or offer easy words of comfort. But between practices, he let Brandon leaf through Bruce's notebook, as if his father's words could be a balm for the physical and emotional pain. One night, after a particularly grueling workout, Brandon sat on the floor of the dojo, his back against the wall, his notebook open on his lap. Dan came over with 2 bottles of water and sat down next to him. He wrote about you the day you were born, Dan said, pointing to a page. He said that for the first time he felt afraid. Not of fighting, not of losing, but of not being good enough for you. Brandon ran his fingers over the words, as if he could feel the emotion behind them. I didn't even know it existed until recently, he confessed. My mother never spoke of him. I only found out when I found a box of photos and newspaper clippings in the attic. Dan wasn't surprised. Bruce had always been a man of few words outside the ring, and his relationship with Brandon's mother had been complicated, marked by fights and silence. He loved you, Dan said simply. Even if I didn't know how to show it. Brandon closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing those words. When he opened them, there was a new determination in his eyes. I want to fight like him, he said. Not just in the ring. In life. Dan smiled, a smile that held years of memories. Then let's get started. The following months were of transformation. Brandon not only learned to fall and get up, but to anticipate movements, to read his opponent's body before he even moved. Dan took him for dawn runs, for endurance training in the hills around town, for silent meditation in the empty dojo. And, little by little, Brandon began to understand what Bruce had seen in that place. It was not just a space for struggle, but a refuge. One afternoon, while the two were resting after an intense session, Dan threw a boxing glove to Brandon. "Tomorrow, you will fight." Brandon caught the glove out of the air, surprised. "Against who?" "Against me." Brandon swallowed. Dan was older, but still fast, still strong. And most of all, he knew every trick Brandon could try. "You're going to destroy me," Brandon said, laughing humorlessly. "Probably," Dan agreed. "But it's not about winning. It's about knowing you're ready." The next morning, the dojo was packed. Dan had invited some old students, friends of Bruce, people who had seen Brandon's father fight and wanted to see his son follow in his footsteps. Brandon entered the makeshift ring with his heart racing, his hands bandaged, Bruce's notebook kept in the corner, like an amulet. Dan climbed in after him, no gloves, just his hands bandaged like Brandon. The two stared at each other for a long moment, and then Dan nodded, signaling to begin. The fight was balanced in the first minutes. Brandon moved with the agility he had developed, dodging blows, counterattacking with precision. But Dan was too experienced. In a moment of distraction, Brandon left an opening, and Dan's punch caught him square in the chin. He fell to the mat, the taste of blood in his mouth. For a second, he thought about giving up. But then he remembered his father's words in the notebook, "The pain is temporary. The shame of giving up is forever." With a grunt, Brandon stood up. Dan didn't smile, but there was pride in his eyes. "Now you understand," he said. Brandon understood. It wasn't about winning. It was about not stopping. In the end, both were exhausted, sweaty, with scarred bodies. But Brandon was standing. And that was all that mattered. Dan held out his hand, and Brandon shook it. "Your father would be proud," Dan said. Brandon looked around the dojo, at the walls that had witnessed so many fights, so many victories and defeats. And for the first time, he felt like he belonged there. "I am too," he replied. And at that moment, Bruce's story was no longer just a memory. It was an inheritance. And Brandon was ready to carry her.